The views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect those of this station.
Welcome to Insights into Northeast Michigan, a WBKB News public affairs program.
I'm Elijah Baker here at WBKB, and here I am with Hope Shores Alliance to talk about sexual assault awareness. There's a startling statistic that 1 in 3 women will be sexually assaulted, and in this specific conversation, we are focusing more so on the women because in most cases, they are sexually assaulted in comparison to men. Right here on the couch, I have Jillian Ferguson from Hope Shores Alliance and Jen Baker here with Hope Shores Alliance. Can you please share with us a little bit about what you do at the center?
Absolutely, yeah. So Hope Shores Alliance is an organization that's dedicated to supporting survivors that are survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So my role within that organization is the sexual assault program coordinator. And so I really want to grow and expand what services we have for sexual assault survivors, as well as do outreach in regards to that.
And my role is the outreach advocacy coordinator. So I oversee all of our outreach efforts within the community, coordinate our trainings with law enforcement and other professionals. And then I also oversee our team of advocates that provide solution-focused advocacy for whatever the survivor needs in that moment, whether that's a PPO or safety planning or just supportive listening.
When it comes to sexual assault awareness, in your professional opinion, what should be the first thing people think about when it comes to sexual assault?
I think we really need to be survivor focused and survivor driven, but the theme for this Sexual Assault Awareness Month is actually I Ask, and that has to do with the conversation surrounding consent. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so consent, obviously, when you're engaging in any type of relationship is huge. I mean, you ask people if you can touch their car, you ask people if you can pet their dog. Why in the world, when you're engaged in a more intimate setting and relationship, would you not ask someone permission to engage in a sexual activity? And there's some talk that it interrupts the moment and it interferes with the mood of the situation, but being safe and making sure that both people are on the same page about what they want and what feels good and what does not feel good comes down to respect.
Mm-hmm. Now, for those who don't fully understand, because there are men and women out there who really don't understand what consent looks like, can you describe scenarios in which people blur the lines with consent when no is no and yes is yes?
Yeah, absolutely. Consent is all about communication and making sure that it's there and that they're giving permission, an ongoing permission to engage in certain activities. So consent is kind of 2 parts. You have to get consent from another person and you have to give your own consent. And so it's ongoing, it's specific, it's clear, it's made without coercion or manipulation. And the other important dynamic there is the power and control. When in certain relationships, members have more power than others or in certain dynamics. And so making sure that we recognize that different relationships throughout our lifetime have different power dynamics, and then respecting that in that conversation of consent and making sure that you are getting and giving consent free of any sort of coercion or manipulation.
It's always, it's also very important to understand about consent is just because someone consented to a certain act at one time, maybe last week, that doesn't necessarily imply their consent for this time, that you still ask in each individual situation and not to make assumptions.
And that's why it's important to indicate that consent is a conversation and it's ongoing. It's very important to clearly check in at multiple times and make sure that you're both on the same page and not to make assumptions. You can never be too specific or clear in regards to what you're receiving consent for or giving consent for.
What is the likelihood of a survivor knowing their offender? Or is it done, or is sexual assault done completely by strangers most of the time?
It's in over 80% of the cases that survivors know their perpetrator. Yeah, usually there's a relationship there. It's very rare that a stranger is the one that perpetrating or sexually assaulting someone. You usually know who it is. Yeah.
Would you guys say that that's a big stereotype, that sexual assault offenders are strangers?
I definitely think that that's where the majority of fear in regards to sexual assault comes from. You know, women are often told, you know, make sure that you don't walk out to your car alone at night. Make sure that, you know, you do all of these things to try and keep you safe. And oftentimes those safety tips that are well-intentioned and meant to be helpful are absolutely not what's helpful, because we're not having those conversations. Because honestly, it's much more difficult to have that honest conversation about sexual assault is most likely to come from someone who has earned and garnered your trust. And that conversation makes people very uncomfortable.
So with that being said, what type of conversations or things that we should be telling our daughters, especially when it comes to sexual assault? Like, hey, I'm taking you over to your uncle's house. If these types of things occur or you feel uncomfortable, you let me know. What type of things should we be telling our young girls, or, you know, our sisters and our moms?
Well, obviously we want young girls to be aware, but we need to switch the conversation from what we're telling young girls and change it to what we're telling everyone, all of our young people in general, about what healthy sexual relationships look like. We need to be talking about what consent is. What can tend to happen is when we're having conversations specifically with girls in relationship to X, Y, and Z, and you need to prepare yourself, is we put blame on survivors for sexual assaults, and the only reason that someone gets raped is because there's a rapist in the room. It's not because a survivor does anything wrong. And when we're talking about childhood sexual assault, I think everybody can get on board and on the same page with kids do not do anything to ask for the violation of their bodies that occurs, right? So why are we having the conversation about what our daughters should do differently when we should be having conversations about what society as a whole should be doing differently? And that really revolves around changing the lens that we look at sexual assault through.
So let's talk about that. Women in the media, not necessarily like media professionals, but just women in general are speaking out to the media about their perpetrators. And we see a lot of conversations in regards to the Me Too movement and believability. How does, if you look at, you know, what happens with children when an adult sexually, you know, assaults them, and then we look at a grown woman who is sexually assaulted by another man, you know, why are those things treated differently, and why don't people believe the woman? Let's talk about, you know, that.
I think that it's a really complicated issue, and the reality is that we're just not very good at talking about sexual assault. We're not very good at handling it.
We're not even very good at talking about healthy sexuality. So to have conversations about sexuality that is coerced or taken and is not healthy, that becomes very uncomfortable for people.
Yeah, there seems to be this underlying, it just, with no other crime do people have to prove it so often, and in the sense that there's a lack of belief, like people just don't believe survivors. And the Me Too movement was all about that, is it happened to me and we believe you and we're standing behind survivors. The reality is that it happens so often to so many people, and we're really failing survivors in terms of we question them, and it's all ingrained in part of this rape culture, right? And so rape culture is just, it's so ingrained in our society, and we constantly shift the conversation from perpetrator accountability to victim risk reduction or victim blaming. What was she wearing? What was she drinking? And the whole conversation—
Why does it get to that? Why is the lens focused on what the victim was doing instead of what the offender was doing?
Well, that runs so deep, and that's such a complicated question. It goes back to ideas of oppression and being marginalized. And ultimately, when we're talking about domestic violence or sexual assault, we're looking at issues of power and control. And so it goes back to someone taking that power away. And so it's not an easy answer.
Yeah, rape culture, like I said, is so ingrained, and that's there because of those power and control dynamics. It's because the people that are controlling the dialogue are the ones that are in power, and if they're able to shift responsibility from someone other than themselves, the reality is abusers are in power oftentimes, and they rely on that power and their credibility and their social standing to get away with these crimes. And
Sorry.
It's okay. And they do everything they can to undermine survivors. And they look for survivors that aren't credible or that are vulnerable or accessible. And it's all part of that power and control dynamic.
And it would require a culture shift.
So what fuels rape culture, and what would it take to put that fire out?
A lot fuels rape culture. I mean, objectification, sexism, portraying women as timid and meek and men as aggressive, and like just the movies and media, and just never ending. I think it's, and what it takes to kind of squash that is just education, is recognizing that regardless of what happened or what the survivor was doing in that instance, it all comes back to that power and control dynamic, and that perpetrators use rape culture to their benefit to say, well, she was doing all these different things, and it instantly takes that focus from them and shifts it to them and puts it on the survivor. And even with risk reduction, we talk about trying to avoid getting sexually assaulted by some of the things you were mentioning. Don't walk alone at night, don't be drinking, travel in groups. And although that sounds like a good thing to do, it's not. It just it's
Because
again
it puts it all on the woman.
Right, right. And that's much easier to say, you change these things, you keep yourself safe, instead of, as a society, we need to make an entire cultural shift in the way that we view these issues and these dynamics, and have some real, honest, deep conversations about what oppression and racism and sexism and how all of those issues play into what's happening within our society. It's much easier to say, don't wear a short skirt.
Would you guys say that our criminal justice system is failing survivors?
I think it goes back to what we were saying before, or what I was saying before, in terms of we're just not good at helping survivors or protecting survivors. The reality is we're not good at necessarily doing or like following through the criminal court system with survivors. It's only 6 out of every 1,000 rapists end up in prison. But that is why we work with survivors to kind of change the conversation about
6 out of what?
1,000 rapists end
When
up
you
in
hear that
prison.
number, what comes to mind, Jen?
Well, it's disgusting, you know, and it's horrifying, and we have to recognize that we have prosecutors and victims advocates that are doing everything they can within the system, but they are also facing those same dynamics, the same power and control, the same ideas of rape culture that fuel all of these other issues, and so it's really an uphill battle for our prosecutors who are trying to get justice for survivors. So we have to look, and we also have to know that survivors don't report nearly as much as sexual assault actually is occurring within our communities. So we have to keep in mind that justice for survivors does not always look like or go through the criminal court system.
While we're talking about believability, what is the likelihood that someone accuses another person of, you know, offending them?
You mean like falsely accuses? It's between 2 and 8%, which is the same as any other crime. And I think that's just talking about being falsely accused or being afraid of being falsely accused is just another way to shift the conversation from the actual issue, because it happens so rarely. And people are much more likely to not report than to report a false crime.
Why? Where does that fear come from?
There are so many different ways. If all you have to do is look at social media to see any article about trials or sexual assault, and you'll have a ton of negative comments and people who are tearing down people who are reporting. Why would you want to report in that dynamic if people are going to turn against you and say that you're not telling the truth? That doesn't make a safe space for people to come forward. And that's why you've seen what's happened with the Me Too movement happen, is because there were some people that said, I don't care what people are going to say about me, I'm going to stand up for this anyway. And once people see that, they feel like it's a little bit safer and they come forward and speak too. And that's different for each survivor, when they feel like this is a safe time for me to disclose and when it's not a safe time to disclose.
What do we say to a friend or family member who has been sexually assaulted, or they come to us and say, hey, this happened to me? what should be our first response in that moment?
So number one is, I believe you. I absolutely believe you, and I'm sorry that that happened. We're fixers. I think most human beings want to be fixers, and so we hear a problem and we want to fix it. And especially with a subject like sexual assault, it's uncomfortable for most people to talk about. And they want to throw out options. They want to direct survivors. Well, you should report to the police. You should go to the hospital and get an exam. You should do this. You should do that. And that's not really what survivors are looking for. And especially if a survivor is received with any kind of judgment that, well, you must have done something. Were you drinking? Were you on drugs? Did this happen? Did that happen? When they're received in that way, survivors might only report one time. And if that's how they're received, that's going to shut them down. And it's unlikely that they're going to continue with anything else in regards to allowing other people to help them in their journey. So believing them is of the utmost importance. That is first and foremost. And then it's not feeling like you have to fix anything for them. It's finding out from the survivor, what do you need from me? How can I help?
Yeah, I think it's always really important to recognize that survivors are whole and empowered human beings, and that they're not broken, then we need to fix them. And that's what our agency is all about, is just working to empower survivors and help them access the resources available to them.
This may sound like a small question, but we say survivors and not victims. Is there power in how we refer to someone who has been assaulted?
Language matters, absolutely, and we don't want to use any language that would reduce a person to what's happened to them. We want to empower them, and I think survivor is a much more empowering term than victim because they're more than what's happened to them.
Mm-hmm. What does justice actually look like for survivors of sexual assault?
It's different, I guess, is the short answer. Kind of going back to what Jen was saying, is it doesn't always look like going through the court system, and that might be what some survivors want, but justice can be a lot of different things, and restorative justice can be a lot of different things.
Now explain what restorative justice is.
It's basically finding what justice means to you in that setting in order to heal from the trauma that has occurred. So often the word justice is associated directly with the court system. You know, was justice served? But it doesn't always look like that for survivors. That's not always what they want. Some survivors know and even love their perpetrator. It can be someone that they've known for a very long time, and they might not want them to go to jail for the rest of their lives. And it's not up to us to pass judgment and to make assumptions about that. Justice can be different, forums, like having a conversation. It can be getting involved in the Me Too movement and telling their story through that. It can be writing it all down or writing a book, or telling, it can be writing a poem. It's really whatever that healing process looks for them.
Yeah, so very individual based on that survivor. And Jillian mentioned that in some cases of sexual assault that survivors love the person that they're with that assaulted them. And so in some cases that looks like, I want that person to get help.
How often is counseling involved with sexual assault survivors? Because we talk about, more than likely it's someone that you know. That can be a father, that can be an uncle, that can be a mom, that can be a sister. Those are close family relationships, and that trust gets broken when that happens. How does that affect the survivor's psyche or what they think about after that happens to them?
Again, it's so unique based on each individual survivor and each particular circumstances.
Yeah, trauma manifests in a lot of different ways. There's no right way to respond to a traumatic situation and no wrong way to respond to a traumatic situation. So there's a lot of healing that has to happen after something like that occurred. And counseling might be a piece of that, supportive listening, advocacy. It's just coming up with that individual empowerment plan for the survivor.
One thing that I see a lot on social media, especially when sexual assault cases are in the media, and people will write in comments, well, why didn't they speak out 20 years ago when this happened? Or why are they just now waiting until this person is getting into power or they're getting a better job? Why do some survivors speak out sooner than others, and why others later than sooner when the incident happened?
I think that it's important to recognize that there's a million reasons why a survivor might not come forward. Like I said before, they could love that person. They could be threatened by that person. They could be fearful of the response of their parents or their community. Those questions, those why questions come up all the time, like why were you drinking? Why were you they could be fearful of that. They could be fearful of talking about it because then it becomes more real and then certain steps happen after that. There's just a million reasons, and so it doesn't. And it comes down to personality as well. Some people might just, after that happens to them, they instantly want to come forward and talk about it. And other people, there's a lot of dynamics that play into that.
Yeah, and I would say for survivors that speak out when they see that the person that assaulted them is going to be in a position of even more authority or power, that motivates a lot of survivors because they're fearful that injustice is going to be perpetrated on other people. And they feel like if they don't speak up, then they have a role in helping that to continue. So that can be a motivation. And as Jillian said, it's different for each survivor what that motivation is. But again, it's important that there's not judgment there. It doesn't matter why that person came forward at this time. All that's important is that they're coming forward and that we're believing them.
I remember seeing on social media this week that someone made a post and said, when men pass by other men, they're touching their upper backs. But when men pass by women, they're touching their lower backs. And she said, men aren't going to touch the lower back of another man when they're passing them by, so why are you doing it to a woman? Is that sexual assault?
Yeah, I think sexual assault is any intimate or sexual content that's taken without consent. So in that situation specifically, there's a power and control dynamic there.
And so think of it in terms of this. If two men were in that situation, why aren't they touching one another's lower back? And it's because it would make the other man uncomfortable. So that's not okay. But when doing it to a woman, they don't take a minute to consider and don't care whether or not that would make the woman uncomfortable.
The reality is in terms of power and control, men are already in a position of power over women because they're usually physically stronger, and then society has put them in a position of power as well. So that power and control dynamic is already there, and that's a manifestation of that power and control, is like touching a lower back without permission.
Some people may think that sexual assault doesn't go beyond the outlines of someone's chest area or butt and private area. What are other instances of sexual assault where you see people do it, and in their minds it doesn't register as them being intimate with another person?
I think just the fact that they don't recognize it as a problem just shows us how deeply ingrained rape culture is, in the sense that they're exerting their power. They're saying that I have the right to touch you this way, in whatever area that is, I have that right, and without consideration of your consent in that situation. So I think that's an area that we need to get better at about talking about sexual assault, is that it doesn't look like this one thing. It's any intimate or unwanted contact, sexual contact. They get to choose when they tell their story, and it's our role as good advocates to not tell them when to tell their story or how to tell their story. It's, a lot of autonomy has been stripped away from them during an assault, and so empowering them to take that back in whatever way that looks like.
For the 2 to 8% who lie about what they say happened to them, how do we treat those cases? What do we do after believing their story? Where do we go from there?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, it's the same as any other crime. And in all honesty, it's such a small portion that it's not worth being freaked out about. I would say that at that point, it's up to investigators and prosecutors to determine what to do with that case, in terms of, it's much less likely that someone will lie about it than someone would not report.
Yeah, and for those that are fearful about being accused of sexually assaulted, people aren't walking around being fearful about being accused of robbing a bank. And statistically, the number is the same percentage. So that we really have to put that in perspective of what that means and what that looks like.
The conversation is not ending here on the couch when we're talking about sexual assault awareness. I hear that Hope Shores Alliance has a candlelight vigil happening on April 24th. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, as part of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we really try to do a lot of outreach and education, and a piece of that is this candlelight vigil that's happening at ACC on April 24th at 7:30. So just going to be a place that we can come together and support survivors in that setting.
And we can't do this work alone. We can't exist in a vacuum, so those partnerships that we have are extremely important to this work because it takes the community to end sexual assault within the community. So we're very grateful to ACC for hosting the event. They've coordinated quite a bit of the event and planned it with us.
All right, and if people want to get more information about Hope Shores Alliance, or someone is saying, I'm in this situation, I want to reach out, how can that survivor do so?
Yeah, we have a 24-hour help and support line that they're welcome to call. That's 989-356-6265. And yeah, we'd be happy to get them with any services that they might need.
Yeah, and if it's not necessarily safe to use the phone, if they have access to Facebook or social media, they can always reach out via our Facebook page as well.
All right, Jillian, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. A pleasure.
Jen, thank you so much. This was a very important conversation. I'm happy we were able to talk about those things today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.